An exploration of Japan's most paradoxical warplane, and the men who flew it knowing they wouldn't come home. April 18, 1943. Lieutenant Takeshi Mori could see smoke trailing from the wing. Not the white vapor trail that every high-altitude aircraft left. This was black smoke, thick and oily, pouring from the No. 2 engine of Admiral Yamamoto's bomber. Mori was flying escort, one of 6 Zero fighters tasked with protecting the 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers carrying Japan's greatest naval strategist to Bougainville. He'd seen this before, too many times. The smoke always came first, then the flames. The G4M, Betty to the Americans, though Mori's squadron had a different name for it, carried 1,200 gallons of fuel in unprotected tanks built directly into the wings. One American .50 caliber round in the wrong place, and physics took over. Fuel plus oxygen plus spark equals fire, always. Mori watched helplessly as the bomber's wing erupted into flame. The aircraft rolled left, diving toward the jungle canopy below. Admiral Yamamoto was aboard, the man who'd planned Pearl Harbor, the man whose portrait hung in every ready room from Rabaul to Tokyo. And he was riding in an airplane that everyone who flew it called Hamaru Hitsugi, the flying coffin. The Betty hit the trees at 200 miles per hour and exploded. Mori circled once, knowing there would be no survivors, then turned for home. He had maybe 40 minutes of fuel left, just enough to make it back to Rabaul and tell his commanding officer that they'd lost another Betty, that they'd lost Yamamoto, that the airplane Japan's Navy had bet everything on had killed the one man they couldn't afford to lose. As he flew back over the Solomon Sea, Mori thought about the meeting 6 weeks earlier, the one where his squadron commander had gathered all the Betty crews and told them the new survival statistics. Of the 120 G4M bombers deployed to Rabaul since January, 87 had been shot down. That was a 72% loss rate. The average crew survived 4 missions. Mori had flown 11. The math was catching up. 6 years earlier, none of this seemed inevitable. In September 1937, Kiro Honjo spread the Imperial Navy's latest specification across his desk at Mitsubishi's Nagoya design office. His team had just finished the G4M, a capable bomber that could reach targets 1,100 miles away. The Navy wanted nearly double that range. They wanted speed, they wanted payload capacity, and they wanted it from just 2 engines. Honjo was 42 years old, a quiet man who'd spent 15 years designing aircraft. He understood immediately what the Navy was asking for, not explicitly, but implicitly buried in those impossible numbers. They were asking him to choose who would die. His assistant, young Tanaka, was the first to say it out loud. "Sir, with 2 engines to get that range." He trailed off, looking at the weight calculations. Honjo finished the thought. "We removed the armor." The room went silent. Every engineer there had studied the reports from China, from Spain, where air combat was teaching brutal lessons about modern warfare. Aircraft needed protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating around crew positions. These weren't luxuries. They were the difference between coming home damaged and not coming home at all. "If we remove protection," Tanaka said carefully, "what's the survival rate?" Honjo didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window looking out at the factory floor where workers were assembling G4M bombers. Good aircraft, solid aircraft, aircraft that brought their crews home. "The Navy believes the war will be short," he said finally. 6 months, maybe a year. They need range to strike first, to achieve strategic surprise. In a short war, survivability doesn't matter as much as reach. "And if they're wrong?" Tanaka asked. "If the war isn't short?" Honjo turned back to face his team. "Then we've built death traps." He approved the design anyway, because if he refused, the Navy would find another manufacturer who wouldn't refuse. At least this way, he could try to make the aircraft as safe as possible within the constraints. He could give it speed, maneuverability, some defensive armament. It wouldn't be enough, but it would be something. That night, Honjo went home and told his wife he'd be working late for the next several months. He didn't tell her that their son, finishing flight training at Tsuchiura, would probably end up flying whatever emerged from those late nights. He didn't tell her that he'd calculated the odds, and they weren't good. The first prototype flew in October 1939. Honjo stood on the tarmac at Nagoya, watching the silver aircraft climb into the morning sky. It was beautiful, graceful in a way that belied its size. The test pilot reported excellent handling, responsive controls, impressive speed. The Navy's observers were ecstatic. The G4M exceeded every performance specification they'd set. Maximum speed, 265 miles per hour. Range with full bomb load, 3,749 miles. The Americans had nothing that could match it. The British had nothing that could match it. One of the Navy observers, a captain named Nakamura, clapped Honjo on the shoulder. "You've built us the weapon that will win the war, Honjo-san." Honjo nodded, accepting the praise. He didn't mention that the aircraft's fuel tanks had no self-sealing capability, that there was no armor protecting the crew, that he'd calculated fuel tank penetration scenarios, and in 89% of cases, the aircraft would be unrecoverable within 45 seconds of being hit. The Navy placed an order for 1,200 aircraft. Production began immediately, December 8, 1941. Lieutenant Takeshi Mori flew his first combat mission. He was 23 years old, newly assigned to the 1st Air Group based on Formosa. The target was Clark Field in the Philippines, 460 miles away. The briefing officer had been enthusiastic. Destroy American air power on the ground, eliminate B-17 bombers before they could strike Japanese forces. It would be a textbook raid. Mori climbed into the bombardier's position in the nose of Betty 323. The aircraft commander, Lieutenant Sakai, was a veteran of the China operations, one of the few men in the squadron who'd actually seen combat. 7 men made up the crew: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, radio operator, and 2 gunners. None of them wore armor. There wasn't any. "Nervous?" Sakai asked over the intercom as they taxied. "No, sir," Mori lied. Sakai laughed. "Good. You should be. But don't worry. This one will be easy. The Americans won't know we're coming." The formation of 53 Betty bombers took off in the pre-dawn darkness. Mori watched Formosa disappear behind them, the coastline fading into the dark ocean. For the first time, he understood what the design range meant. They were flying beyond the reach of any rescue. If they went down over water, the South China Sea would be their grave. But the mission went perfectly. They arrived over Clark Field to find rows of B-17s parked wingtip to wingtip. No fighters rose to intercept. The Bettys dropped their bombs methodically, destroying aircraft and installations. American air power in the Philippines was eliminated in one strike. On the flight back, Mori felt invincible. The Betty had performed flawlessly. They'd struck deep into enemy territory and escaped without a scratch. Maybe the Navy had been right. Maybe range was all that mattered. 2 days later, they attacked British warships. The mission was supposed to be impossible, attacking battleships at sea with land-based bombers. But the Betty's range made it possible. 85 aircraft launched from Indochina, flying east over the Gulf of Thailand. Mori was in the first wave. They found HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse steaming through calm seas. The battleships opened fire, filling the sky with anti-aircraft bursts. Mori watched tracer rounds arc up toward them, looking like strings of pearls in the tropical sunlight. The first Betty exploded. One moment it was in formation, the next it was a fireball tumbling toward the ocean. Maury didn't even see what hit it. An anti-aircraft shell, probably. But the result was unmistakable. The Betty's fuel tanks had ignited, consuming the aircraft in seconds. 3 more bombers burned before they dropped their torpedoes. But they sank both ships. The Prince of Wales took 4 torpedo hits and multiple bombs. The Repulse took 5 torpedoes. Both battleships went down, taking 840 British sailors with them. It was the first time in history that aircraft alone had sunk capital ships at sea. The Betty crews who survived were treated as heroes. The Emperor himself sent congratulations. Nobody talked about the 4 aircraft that hadn't come home. Nobody mentioned how quickly they'd burned. In the victory celebration, those deaths seemed like acceptable losses. The strategic result justified the cost. Maury attended the memorial service for the crew of Betty 271. He'd trained with the Bombardier, a kid from Osaka who loved baseball. Maury tried to imagine what those last 45 seconds had been like. The fire racing through the fuel tanks, the skin temperature inside the aircraft rising to unbearable levels, the choice between burning and jumping without a parachute from 8,000 feet. He couldn't imagine it. He didn't want to. By mid-1942, everything changed. Maury's squadron redeployed to Rabaul, Japan's massive base in the southwest Pacific. The missions now targeted Guadalcanal, 600 miles south, where American Marines had seized an airfield. The Betty was the only aircraft with the range to strike it from Rabaul, but the Americans weren't surprised anymore. They had radar. They had better fighters, Wildcats first, then Hellcats, and they'd learned where to aim. Shoot for the wings, American fighter pilots told each other. One good burst in the fuel tanks and they light up like matches. The Betty's vulnerability wasn't theoretical anymore. It was statistical, predictable, lethal. August 8, 1942. Maury flew his 6th mission to Guadalcanal. 18 Betty bombers in formation. No fighter escort. The Zeros didn't have the range to accompany them all the way. The mission commander tried to sound confident at the briefing, but Maury could hear the strain in his voice. The last 2 missions had lost 1/3 of their aircraft. They were 200 miles from Guadalcanal when the radio operator called out, "Fighters, 10 o'clock high!" Maury counted 12 Wildcats diving toward them. The Betty gunners opened fire, their 7.7 millimeter machine guns chattering. It sounded impressive until you saw what the Americans were firing back. 50 caliber machine guns, 6 per fighter, each round capable of punching through aluminum skin like paper. The first Betty in their formation exploded, just like that. One burst from a Wildcat's guns and it vanished in a fireball. The second Betty tried to evade, banking hard. Maury watched tracer rounds stitch across its wing. Smoke appeared, then flames. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell toward the ocean, trailing fire. Betty 323, Maury's aircraft, was next. He felt the impacts before he heard them. Thuds transmitted through the airframe as bullets tore through aluminum. The intercom filled with screaming. Someone shouted, "Fire! Fire in the wing!" Maury looked left. Orange flames were crawling along the wing, spreading backward from the fuel tanks. The fire was inside the structure, not just on the surface. That meant the fuel tanks were breached. That meant they had maybe 60 seconds before the wing failed. Sakai's voice cut through the panic. Bail out now." Maury scrambled toward the side hatch. The heat was incredible. The cabin temperature was rising by the second as fire consumed the wing. He got the hatch open, felt the slipstream tear at him. 200 miles per hour felt like hitting a wall. He jumped. The parachute deployed, jerking him hard. Below, Betty 323 continued its trajectory for another 30 seconds. Then the wings separated. The fuselage broke apart, and the whole thing tumbled into the Solomon Sea, trailing smoke and flame. Maury counted 3 other parachutes in the sky. That meant 3 survivors out of 7 crew. 4 men had gone down with the aircraft, either killed in the initial attack or trapped by the speed at which the fire spread. He spent 4 hours in the ocean before a submarine picked him up. Of the 18 Bettys that launched that morning, only 5 made it back to Rabaul. The squadron commander called a meeting that evening. Lieutenant Commander Ota was a career officer, 42 years old, with a face that looked carved from stone. He'd flown the G4M in China, survived 3 years of combat. Now he commanded a Betty squadron that was being destroyed faster than replacements could arrive. "Gentlemen, he said, I've been ordered to continue operations against Guadalcanal. The Navy requires us to disrupt American operations on the island. I've been told this is a strategic priority." He paused, looking at the 37 men gathered in the ready room, all that remained of a squadron that had deployed with 90. "I've also been told that crew protection modifications are being considered. Self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating. The engineering staff at Nagoya is studying the problem." Mori raised his hand. "Sir, what's the timeline?" Ota's expression didn't change. 18 to 24 months. The room erupted. 2 years! Half the men in this room would be dead in 2 months at current loss rates, and the Navy was talking about modifications in 2 years? Ota held up his hand for silence. "I understand your frustration. I share it. I've submitted reports detailing our survival rates. I've requested that operations be suspended until aircraft modifications are implemented. My requests have been denied." "Why?" someone asked. "Because the Navy designed its entire offensive strategy around the G4M's range," Ota said flatly. "Admitting the aircraft is fundamentally flawed means admitting the strategy is wrong. Institutional pride is more important than your lives." He let that sink in. "You have my permission to request transfer to another unit. No one will think less of you. The missions we're being asked to fly are close to suicidal." Nobody moved, not because of courage or dedication, but because everyone understood the arithmetic. They were pilots trained at enormous expense, needed throughout the Navy. If they left this squadron, they'd just end up in another Betty unit somewhere else. The aircraft was Japan's primary land-based bomber. There was nowhere to hide. "Very well," Ota said. "Mission briefing at ERO 600. Dismissed." Mori walked back to his quarters where he wrote a letter to his parents. He didn't mention the loss rates or the aircraft's vulnerabilities. He told them he was well, that the squadron was performing its duty, that he hoped to see them when the war ended. He didn't believe he'd survive that long, but some lies were necessary. The modifications finally came in late 1944. Mori, now a captain, visited the Nagoya factory where the G4M3, the protected variant, was being produced. 3 years and thousands of dead airmen after the problem became obvious, the Navy had finally authorized self-sealing fuel tanks and improved armor. Kiro Honjo, grayer now, thinner, walked him through the changes. "The fuel tanks are properly protected," he explained. "Rubber liners that swell and seal punctures. It adds 800 pounds, but survival rate should increase by—" "Where were these 3 years ago?" Mori interrupted. Honjo stopped, meeting his eyes. "I designed them 3 years ago. The Navy rejected them because they reduced maximum range by 1,800 miles. They said the range reduction was unacceptable. How many of us died because of that decision?" Honjo looked away. "I don't know. Thousands, probably. My entire original squadron is gone," Mori said quietly. 90 men. I'm the only one still alive. We kept flying missions in aircraft we knew were death traps because the Navy's pride was more important than our survival." "I know," Honjo said. "I have a son. He flies Bettys. He's deployed to the Philippines. Every day I wonder if this is the day I get the telegram." And they stood in silence watching workers assemble G4M3s on the factory floor. Better aircraft arriving too late. Only 60 would be completed before the war ended. The vast majority of Betty crews would fly and die in the original unprotected variants. "I'm sorry," Honjo said finally. I designed what the Navy asked for. I should have refused. I should have insisted on protection from the beginning, even if it cost us the contract." Maury shook his head. "If you'd refused, they would have found someone else. This isn't your fault. It's what happens when institutions value performance metrics over human lives." August 19th, 1945. Maury stood on the tarmac at Atsugi Airfield. Two white G4M bombers painted with green crosses sat ready for their final mission. They would carry Japanese surrender delegates to Manila to negotiate the end of the war. Maury had been selected as aircraft commander for the lead aircraft, a dubious honor. He walked around Betty 452, inspecting it for the last time. An unprotected Model 2, one of over 2,000 built. How many had been destroyed? How many crews had burned? The numbers were too large to comprehend. Of the 90 men in his original squadron, Maury was the sole survivor. 11 missions in 1941 to 1942, then transferred to training command, probably saving his life. Most of his friends hadn't been that lucky. Lieutenant Sakai, his first aircraft commander, shot down over Guadalcanal in November 1942. The gunner Nakamura killed when his Betty exploded on takeoff. Fully fueled aircraft were prone to catastrophic failure even without enemy action. The radio operator, young Yamada, who'd just gotten married, his aircraft caught fire after being hit by a single .50 caliber round, exactly where Honjo's engineers had predicted it would be vulnerable. All gone, all burned. All because someone decided range was more important than armor. Maury climbed into the cockpit and started the engines. The Betty flew smoothly, as it always had. The problem was never the aircraft's performance. It was what happened when that performance met reality. They flew to Yashima first, then to Manila. American fighters escorted them the entire way, insurance against misunderstanding. Maury looked out at the Corsairs flying alongside, remembering when aircraft like those had meant death. Now they meant protection. The irony wasn't lost on him. At Manila, American officers watched the White Bettys land. Maury saw some of them pointing, talking. He wondered how many pilots out there had shot down Bettys, how many had watched them burn. The Bettys' vulnerability had been so extreme that shooting them down became routine. Target practice for new pilots building confidence. One American officer approached as Maury climbed down. "G4M?" he asked, gesturing at the aircraft. "Yes," Maury said in careful English. "We called them flying Zippos. Light 'em up with one burst." Maury nodded. He'd heard the nickname. Most Japanese aircrew had their own version. Hamaru Hitsugi, flying Coffin. "Lost a lot of good men in these?" the American asked. "Yes, many." The American looked at the Betty, then back at Maury. "I'm sorry, war's a bastard." They stood there for a moment, two men who'd been trying to kill each other for 4 years, united by the recognition that both sides had sent men into battle in aircraft with fatal flaws. The Americans had learned to protect their crews. Japan hadn't. That difference explained a lot about how the war had ended. Kiro Honjo survived the war. He continued working in aviation, though never again in military design. When asked about the G4M in a 1963 interview, he was characteristically blunt. "I designed an aircraft to meet impossible specifications. It performed exactly as promised, exceptional range through ruthless weight reduction. The Navy got what they asked for. They just didn't understand what they were asking for." The interviewer pressed, did he regret the design? Honjo thought for a long moment. "I regret that I didn't refuse. I regret that I allowed institutional pressure to override my engineering judgment. I knew the aircraft would be vulnerable. I calculated the survival statistics. I approved it anyway because I convinced myself the Navy's strategic assumptions were correct, that the war would be short, that first strike capability mattered more than survivability. I was wrong. The war wasn't short, and thousands of young men paid for my mistake with their lives." He never designed another military aircraft. Today, no complete G4M exists in any museum. The aircraft were destroyed so thoroughly, in combat by bombing through deliberate post-war scrapping, that only fragments remain. A section of wing here, an engine cowling there, pieces of twisted aluminum that once carried men to their deaths across the Pacific. This absence is appropriate. The Betty was built to be consumed, to burn fuel reaching distant targets, then burn itself when hit. Nothing about its design prioritized preservation or survival. It was optimized for a single strategic moment, and when that moment passed, the aircraft became a liability that killed everyone associated with it. The American bombers that fought the same war survive in profusion. B-17s and B-24s sit in museums worldwide. Their armor plating still visible, their self-sealing fuel tanks still intact. These aircraft could absorb tremendous punishment because they were designed with crew survival as a non-negotiable requirement. The contrast teaches everything you need to know about institutional priorities. Japan chose range over people. They built an aircraft that could reach anywhere but couldn't bring anyone home. They maintained that choice for 3 years, even as loss rates made the aircraft's vulnerability undeniable, because admitting the design was flawed meant admitting their entire strategic doctrine was wrong. Institutional pride killed more Japanese airmen than American fighters did. Takeshi Mori lived until 1998. He rarely spoke about the war, but near the end of his life, he gave a series of interviews to a military historian. "People ask if I was angry," he said. "Angry at Honjo for designing the Betty, angry at the Navy for ordering it, angry at the Americans for shooting us down. I wasn't angry. I was sad. Sad for all my friends who burned. Sad for the waste. We knew the Betty was dangerous. Everyone knew. The pilots knew. The ground crews knew. The engineers knew. Even the admirals knew, though they never admitted it. We kept flying anyway because duty demanded it, because our nation asked, because the alternative was to admit that thousands had already died for a mistake, and no institution can admit that kind of failure." He paused, looking out the window of his Tokyo apartment at the modern city beyond. The Betty could fly farther than any other aircraft in the world. It could reach targets the Americans didn't think we could touch. For 6 months, it was the most dangerous bomber in the Pacific. And then for 3 years, it was a death trap. We kept flying it because changing course would have required someone important to say, "I was wrong." Nobody important ever said that. The Betty taught me that the most dangerous thing in war isn't the enemy. It's your own side's refusal to admit mistakes. Mori died at 78, one of the few men who flew Bettys operationally and survived old age. At his funeral, a fellow veteran mentioned that Mori had flown 11 combat missions in 1941 to 1942. In a Betty squadron, 11 missions made you ancient. The lesson isn't subtle. Optimize for one variable at the exclusion of everything else, and you create fragility. The Betty was a perfect answer to a narrow question. How do we strike first in a short war? It delivered exceptional range through ruthless deletion of protective features. In the war, Japan's planners imagined 6 months of lightning strikes ending in negotiated peace. The design made sense. That war never happened. Instead, Japan got 4 years of grinding attrition, where survival mattered more than reach, where experienced crews were irreplaceable, where every loss weakened the next mission. In that war, the Betty's optimization became catastrophic. Modern institutions make this mistake constantly. Maximize quarterly earnings by gutting long-term investment. Maximize efficiency by eliminating redundancy. Maximize performance by removing safety margins. Each optimization makes perfect sense on paper, assuming conditions remain ideal. Conditions never remain ideal. The Americans who designed the B-17 weren't smarter than Kiro Honjo. They just had different priorities. They built an aircraft that could be damaged, return home, share lessons learned, and fly again tomorrow. That resilience, that refusal to sacrifice everything for peak performance, meant the force got stronger over time instead of consuming itself. By 1945, American bomber crews were more experienced and capable than in 1942 because they survived to learn from mistakes. Japanese Betty crews in 1945 were less experienced than in 1942 because veterans kept dying and taking their knowledge with them. You can't build institutional memory if nobody survives to remember. The Betty's ghost haunts every modern discussion about optimization versus resilience. When software companies ship products with security vulnerabilities to hit deadlines, they're making the Betty calculation short-term performance over long-term survival. When finance firms maximize quarterly returns by increasing systemic risk, they're building flying Zippos, systems that perform brilliantly until they encounter unexpected stress, then fail catastrophically. When military procurement selects weapons based on ideal test conditions rather than worst-case scenarios, they're repeating the mistake that killed thousands of Japanese airmen. The pattern repeats because the incentives remain unchanged. Institutions reward spectacular metrics in favorable conditions. They punish the cautious designer who builds in margins, redundancy, protection, all the things that look like waste until conditions deteriorate. Kiro Honjo understood this. He designed the Betty knowing it was vulnerable, betting that favorable conditions would persist long enough to justify the trade-off. He was a brilliant engineer, making a rational calculation based on available information. He was also catastrophically wrong, and thousands of young men burned because of it. Can we learn from this? Can institutions actually internalize that resilience matters more than peak performance, that surviving to learn from failure is more valuable than spectacular success in ideal conditions? The honest answer? Probably not. Every generation seems condemned to rediscover that systems optimized for perfect conditions fail catastrophically when conditions aren't perfect. The Betty's lesson is 80 years old, and we're still building flying Zippos in different industries with different specifications, but the same fundamental flaw. But maybe the men who flew and died in those pink-orange Pacific skies can teach us something if we listen. They deserved aircraft that could protect them. They deserved institutions that valued their survival as much as mission performance. They deserved leaders willing to say, "I was wrong," before thousands died proving it. They got none of those things, and the Betty, graceful, fast, long-ranged, became synonymous with institutional failure wrapped in brilliant engineering. A reminder that you can build exactly what was requested and still create disaster if the request was wrong. 2 white Bettys flew delegates to Manila, carrying surrender documents. Those aircraft represented everything Japan hoped to achieve: power projection, strategic reach, the ability to strike anywhere across the vast Pacific. They flew that final mission, not in triumph, but in defeat, carrying papers that ended the war the Betty was supposed to win. The Betty could reach anywhere. It just couldn't come home. And in that failure lies the lesson. Range isn't everything. Performance isn't everything. The numbers that look best on paper aren't everything. Coming home is everything. The thousands who didn't come home taught us that. We should remember.